am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're going to do an interesting and slightly unusual yarn dyeing experiment. This is a skein of Knit Picks Stroll Thin Green Weight yarn straight from the mill. Well, straight from Knit Picks warehouse, I suppose. The yarn is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. Okay, and if we unfold it, we have our skein like this, where the opening is sort of here in the middle, but the two sides are laid on top of one another currently. I had a question on my most recent self-striping yarn dyeing video about whether you could take a skein and dye self-striping yarn from it without reskeining it by dyeing sections of color that go down along the length of the skein, sort of in sections like that. And well, let's talk about this. With self-striping yarn, you typically want really long sections of color. So that way when you're knitting, say, a sock with it, you'll have one color that'll last multiple rounds of the sock, and then you don't have to change colors in between to get those stripes. But in order to dye that kind of yarn, you need to make a really long skein. I've made some that are, goodness, I think 14 feet around, skeins that are longer than I am tall, to give that self-striping effect. Whereas the skein I just showed you is a lot shorter. If I dyed it half of the skein in one color, half another color, you might get some spiraling or something micro stripe related depending on your gauge, but you're not gonna have stripes that are like multiple rows long on a pair of socks because the yarn just isn't long enough for that. Typically when we have, say, a skein of yarn and we want to dye it a variegated color, we bring the colors in and dye it across in areas like this. So we're going across all of the strands of yarn. This gives us something that has a little bit of balance and consistency, because if you have a stripe of color that goes all the way across, it's going through all of the strands of yarn, and it doesn't matter where the beginning and the end is, you have consistency there. If we were to take the skein and dye sort of with the strands and dye our colors sort of in segments like this, you are much more likely to end up with something that is asymmetric. Now, we don't know which strand in here right now is the first strand at the beginning of the skein. It's not necessarily at one of the edges, it could be somewhere in the middle. So when we dye the skein half one color and half another, we'll likely end up with something asymmetric, but we could end up with different patterns. We could end up with something, and we'll test this with reskeining, that is like half one color, half another, but I think we're much more likely to have something that is a little bit more like this. So I think we'll have a lot of sections that are very variegated, and then maybe still something with some asymmetry where we'll have more of one color on one side and more of the other on the other, but I think we'll end up with a lot of section that is more variegated in there. So my plan for today is to take our skein, we'll pre-soak it, and then we're gonna hand paint one color along one side, sort of like this. I don't know if we'll use a foam brush or what yet. We'll do a second color along the second side. And so it'll look like sort of a two-toned yarn, but then we'll go ahead once it's dry and reskein it so we can see what the actual progression of it is like. And so depending on the results, I would be very happy to do this again with 3 colors or something and play around with it more. But this sort of goes against, we're breaking some rules here. It goes against the gut of how I typically dye yarn, which is fun. I love breaking the rules and mixing things up. So Knit Pick skeins that come from the mill have butterfly ties on them, but these ties are trying to keep it ordered, and this isn't necessarily separating it into, you know, this is the first third, this is the middle third, that's the last third. That's really not the way things end up, because as the skeins are getting wound, the strands could be moving sort of up and down this section. It's not necessarily going from one end to the other. But when I reskein the yarn by hand, I can make it so it goes from one end to the other. Oh dear. This brings a logical question and follow-up about, well, why don't you just reskein the yarn first, then hand paint it? You know where the beginning, the middle, and the end is. This is intriguing and something I could do. But if you're gonna go ahead and go to that trouble, you may as well, as you're winding the skein by hand, divide it into connected mini skeins so you have little bundles and know, okay, I want 10 wraps on 10 wraps to be this color, then the next 10, then the next 10. And so you could sort of separate it like that, so that way you can get the colors exactly where you want. So just throwing out there that if you're gonna go through fiber prep to get self-striping, you may as well go through the fiber prep to get that self-striping. Hope that makes sense. Since I'm planning on hand painting this colorway, I'm gonna add a couple, maybe 3 tablespoons of white vinegar to our Presoak. We may add acid to our dye mixtures as well. I have not yet decided. And I'm gonna go ahead and Presoak the yarn for at least 30 minutes so things are nice and well saturated. Today we are gonna dye by feel, and we're gonna use some older dye stocks that I have of Caribbean blue. I'm gonna pour some of this into there, and an old dye stock of midnight blue. And I know we will have plenty of contrast between these two colors. And I'm just gonna pour some of that in there. We may not use all of this dye that I've allocated, but the reason why I have diluted the dyes, each of these containers started with 2/3 cup of water. And so that way, when we eventually add these onto the yarn, I'm able to spread out the color more than I would have been able to do if I was applying it directly from the dye stocks. I just added a fraction of a tablespoon, like that much, to each of our dye containers. And I have added some plastic wrap onto the work surface. I have gently squeezed out as much of the water as I can from here. And now I am going to try to spread this out. Now, a lot of times when I spread yarn, I try to scrunch it to sort of mix things up. But I am attempting to have 2 sections here, like one for one color, one for the other, and one for intermediate. Maybe we'll leave some white, but notice that unlike hair, there's no place where I can reasonably part this from, because we really just don't know where the sectioning occurs. But I've done my best to have things go around this way and to roughly divide it. The reason why we have plastic wrap here today is so that way we can roll up the yarn when we're done to try to keep the colors from spreading onto our different sections. And I'm planning on applying our dye today with a foam brush. I mean, really, in theory, I should be applying it this way versus having the brush like this, which is what I would normally do. So maybe I'll try to keep it in line with what we are attempting here today. Oh my goodness. And we'll see how much this color I can spread it versus leaving some whites behind. One reason why I like applying dye when I'm hand painting with a brush like this is that it helps me both squish the dye through the yarn a little bit, at least in places, but it also allows me, it feels like it allows me to add less liquid, and so things will be less likely to drip overall, in theory. Okay, but that's the start of our blue. I guess both colors are blue. You can also use squeeze bottles for this, but I find that if I use squeeze bottles, then I'm definitely likely to get variation. We're gonna have a lot of tonal variation in here though, because I mean, you can even see it in there. With acid in our fiber already, the colors are gonna strike in different areas pretty quickly, likely. And if I lift up this section, you can see the color isn't going all the way through. Probably for either, yeah. I don't know if you can see that, but it's not going all the way through. I will have to attempt a flip and to add more color. And so I think it's best that I just carry on. One thing I had on hand are some paper towels, so that way I can dab up any drips of dye that we have. And I really worked to apply the midnight blue to one side, the Caribbean blue to the other, and I left that area in the middle a lot empty until I had made it through most of the skein. Mainly because I was still a bit undecided if I should leave that middle area as a third color or if I should try to meet in the middle with our two blues. One argument for leaving the middle as it is that it would tell us a little bit if that white is concentrated in the center when I reskein, or if we see the white all the way through as I'm reskeining it. So filming this voiceover had me leaning more towards leaving that white there, just so that way we could see what happens. And this is giving us a third color. And the other thing is that if the colors spread, it gives a little bit of a buffer between them. Even though when I get to the top, ooh, I don't know what I'll do around the zip tie. We'll get there when we get there. And now that I've rambled all this, I may even go change my mind. We'll see where we are. As we started to approach the end, I decided to go ahead and cover up that white buffer area we had in the middle. Things are lifting and shifting a bit as I do this, and because sometimes the yarn will stick to the brush a little bit, and I figured I have the dye, I may as well add color to that section. As best I can, anyway. You may have noticed that I mixed up a little bit more dye. That was to just help with the coverage. We've got tonal variations. Some of the areas in the middle might be a little lighter, but ultimately I think that that is going to be just fine. What I want to do now is let things just sit for a little bit. There is a reasonable amount of liquid, and so as soon as I lift it and roll it, things are going to squish out. And so if I leave this at just room temperature for 30 minutes, I think that that might allow some of the colors to set a little bit. So that way we can keep this line present as much as possible. Oh man. What ultimately changed my mind in the end was the fact that things are narrower right here, and I realized that that could give us, unless I took the zip tie off and spread it, then it would be hard to keep the lines sort of straight that way. And so to see just how much asymmetry we have in the end, we did things this way. Maybe we'll try it again if we like the results. Maybe not. But anyway, I'll see you in 30 minutes. Smart Rebecca would have already had a steamer basket ready to go. And I don't think I'm that smart today. Because I did not do that. But let's go ahead and start wrapping this up. I do have a steamer basket heating up now. Yeah, and the goal is to try to keep the different colors from touching each other, but obviously there's areas in that center where the color could bleed. But I'm going to take this to the steamer basket now. And things aren't that warm or steamy in here yet, as I run around looking for the lid. But it's also not zero heat. I mean, do we see any steam? I feel a little bit. Slowly. Oh, there we go. We can see we're steaming up a little bit. Oh my goodness. I'm going to go ahead and steam set this for 40 minutes just because it's going to take some time to warm up. And so at which point we will come back. Okay, it has been 30 minutes and our jelly roll should be nice and warm, which is good. And I want to set it aside so it can cool and so we can wash it. And I can unroll it. I know we're slightly off camera. But if I unroll it like I just did, then it should cool off a little bit faster. Let's wash our yarn. This is so trippy to me to see the yarn like this. It makes it look like a collection of minis. I mean, that's part of the point, right? We're hoping that we'll see some asymmetry in the finished project. But I don't know, this is so fun. I'm not seeing any color come off in the water, which is also good. Now, depending on the results we get here, that doesn't mean that we'd get the exact same results with another skein, because different skeins could be wound slightly differently, and so there may or may not be, yeah, there's no bleeding. There may or may not be reproducibility easily with this type of separating the yarn, but you never know unless you try. And sometimes it's fun to go against convention just to see what will happen. Because no matter what, you're going to get a yarn that is fun. It just might be like blended together in a weird way. So I'm going to go put this through the spin dryer to spin out the rest of the water. It'll help it dry a little faster. And I'll see you probably tomorrow where we'll wind this onto a nitty knotty to see how it turns out. You can dye a beautiful variegated self-striping yarn with a sock blank by sort of hand painting horizontal stripes across it. And that is a lot of fun. I have had questions about doing vertical stripes there as well, but I think that would just give you more of a variegated yarn, similar. There would be some differences to what you would get just by dyeing a skein, but it doesn't necessarily take advantage of the fact that you can have something completely asymmetrical and planned when you're dyeing a sock blank. But anyway, let's go look at the dry yarn and then get ready to reskein it. Here is our yarn before I go and reskein it. I've even left the zip tie on. Whoop. So if I take this off, I can still sort of lay this out in the approximately half purple, half blue way that we dyed it. But if I lift up and look at the yarn, okay, here are 2 strands that transition from purple to blue. Here are 3 more, here are 4 more. So the question is, how variegated will it be? Because certainly we're going to go back and forth between colors multiple times. I just don't know how many. We do have some white spots in here. I'm not worried about that, but I'm glad that I did go with the dye all the way to the center, so that way, hopefully, we'll get a sense of the transition. So let's go reskein it, and I'll come back with the yarn on the nitty knotty. And as I'm winding onto the nitty knotty, I forget if sometimes it's more comfortable to have the yarn go from the outside in. So like as I wind, then I push it out, or start in and move further out. But I'm going to attempt to have one end of the yarn at one side and one end at the other. So that way when I take it off the nitty knotty, we'll get a sense of what, if any, gradient or asymmetry looks like. I am shocked, surprised, definitely not speechless. But the results from the reskeining are not what I expected. Even though we painted the skein half one color, half the other, we ended up with a variegated yarn that's repeating blue, purple, blue, purple. A lot of repeating. It doesn't feel like we have any kind of gradient at all. The lengths of the different sections range from, you know, a couple inches long to at most 2 whole wraps around the nitty knotty. So this could give some combination of some stripes and micro stripes. Again, I am very surprised because sometimes if you just dip dye a 4-foot skein similar to this, you'll end up with micro stripes because the colors will kind of spiral, and so then you'll get something visually that looks like stripes. These will be a bit longer than that because it's almost as though for a lot of it, the way we painted it, we got a full loop of one color before it transitioned to the other. So I think that when these are being wound, where the strand is placed moves back and forth along the skein in a way that really balances where the yarn is. And I know that those scribbles I just put up are not very good at illustrating it, but you know, I think that it's when the yarn, as it was being wound onto the thing, the yarn sort of moved up and down a little bit. Similar to if you've ever wound a bobbin on a sewing machine and the strand moves up and down so it doesn't all clump in one spot, so you get like an even distribution of the thread. I think something like that is happening, which has resulted in us ending up with what we have. But the reason why I'm in front of the camera right now, and I'll go and give some flat pictures of this in a moment. The reason why I'm in front of the camera is that this worked and gave us a potentially self-striping micro stripe that's gonna have a randomness to it. It's gonna be an incredibly fun yarn. A yarn that I'm not swatching because the transitions aren't gonna be regular, so whatever I get on the swatch isn't necessarily gonna repeat, but there will be back and forth between the two colors. But just because this happened one time doesn't mean it'll happen the same way again. And so if I did this 4 times all on Knit Pick Stroll, we could end up with one that has some more asymmetry to what we have here. And when you work with it, there could be more asymmetry. There could be one side where the purple sections are bigger, the other, the blue, are a little bigger, but I didn't notice any of that happening specifically as I was just winding it by hand. And different brands could wind things differently too. But I think that one of the reasons for things are wound the way it is it makes it easier to unravel, to put on a Swift, to wind into a ball. But again, I am surprised. But you know what this means? This means that when I have a skein of yarn and I think, oh, it doesn't feel that balanced, and I open it up and there's like a big chunk of white or a color on like a fraction of the skein, that means that there's a potential for that to be more balanced than I thought. It's just that that patch of color might show up, it might be more spaced out than otherwise it could have been. And so this means I can be a lot less stressed about something potentially feeling asymmetric. And it also means that you can't really tell if something's going to be asymmetric from looking at the skein as it was dyed. You can get a feel that, okay, things might be more random, that white may not show up on every round. That you could know, but maybe it means I need to be a little less stressed out when I feel like things are unbalanced. I don't know, that's exciting to me. The Reskeined yarn really surprised me. Let me take it off of the Nitty Knotty. Believe it or not, we got something so balanced. It's possible that as you go through a knit, there will be one end that has more purple and one end that has more turquoise. But as I was rewinding the yarn, maybe each color would be 1 or 2 full wraps of either the blue or the purple. Sometimes there were really short sections in between, but it did alternate back and forth a lot. And so there are some sections that I would say are between 3 to maybe 7 or 8 feet long, which is enough for a small stripe. But then it goes back and forth and those lengths are fairly random. I'm not planning on knitting a swatch of this for this video because although we might get a sense of some of the random striping pattern, the striping pattern doesn't repeat throughout this yarn. So while I don't have anything off of the top of my head that I observed, you could have things that feel irregular and random with the bit of striping pattern from micro stripes to something a little bit thicker. And micro stripes would be one round that is a color, or the appearance of one round that's a color. Plus, I think that if I were to do this a second and third time, there's no guarantee that we would end up with something just like this. We could end up with something more asymmetric. And so since we don't know that that's what's going to happen, it makes it harder to predict. I want to give a huge thank you to the person who suggested this experiment. I was so hesitant to try it because I was sure that I would end up with something unbalanced and it wouldn't give self-striping yarn, but it kind of did. And so I'm very surprised and pleased, because just because you don't think something will work out in a certain way, at least for me filming these videos, doesn't mean I shouldn't give it a try, because, well, then I can try it out and then you can decide if you want to try it for yourself. And when I showed the flat lay of the yarn, I did wind it from one end to another, so I had it pretty well laid out, and you can see how cleanly these colors are distributed through the yarn. Of course, looking at the yarn like this, what you can't tell is how variegated it is or how long those color sections are, but, you know, I'll try to describe it as best I can in the description. Pre-orders for the 2024 Summer Mini Skein Mini Series yarn sets are now available in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. This year's SMSMS will start on July 8th, and every night there will be a new yarn dyeing video featuring mini skeins and creating mini skein sets. And your mystery set of 5 20-gram mini skeins will be featured in one of the videos. There's a huge variety of yarn bases that you have to pick from, and the whole thing is going to be so much fun. There'll be cute packaging, fun extras, and there's even some add-ons, and you can learn more over in the listing in my Etsy shop. I'll have it linked down in the video description. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I would be willing to try this experiment again, with the caveat that I don't necessarily want to have to re-skein the yarn. I could use my automated skein winder and it would be faster, but it would be harder for me to keep track of how long various repeats are, because I want to make sure that I can accurately share how things all came together. But if you buy this yarn in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop, let me know how it turned out. I am so curious how this ended up working out. Subscribe and do all those YouTubey things, and thank you so much for watching.